Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into the horrific shooting in Tel Aviv, going deeper than the headlines.
You're here because you want to understand the why behind the what, and that's exactly what we are going to do.
So, October 1st, 2024, picture a regular afternoon on Jerusalem Boulevard in Jaffa. Busy, people going about their day, and then suddenly gunfire erupts on a crowded light rail train.
6 people dead, at least 12 injured, some critically. Just a horrific, senseless tragedy.
Now, Israeli authorities immediately declared this a terrorist attack, and the details really leave no room for doubt. 2 Palestinian gunmen, both from the West Bank. One was killed at the scene, the other critically wounded.
But this didn't happen in a vacuum. This attack is part of a larger pattern of escalating tensions in the region. And speaking of escalating tensions, this attack occurred at a very interesting time, didn't it?
You're absolutely right to focus on the timing because just before the shooting, there was a significant Israeli military operation.
And that operation was targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon. They called them punishing strikes. These strikes were intended to, well, punish Hezbollah, but also to degrade their military capabilities and send a strong message.
Right, right.
But here's where it gets even more complicated. Almost at the same time as the shooting, a barrage of missiles fired by Iran was aimed at Tel Aviv.
Wow.
So the really big question is, was this just an awful coincidence, or was this part of a coordinated attack?
Yeah, a coordinated attack would suggest a whole different level of planning and motive.
Exactly. And while we don't have definitive answers yet, figuring out the answer to that question is going to be crucial to really understanding the potential consequences of this event.
It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical weeds here, but we have to remember that at the heart of this are real people whose lives are changed forever.
One story that really got to me was that of Aaron Nissan, a 33-year-old guy from Jaffa. He was out with his partner, just getting groceries, trying to get ahead of any, potential missile threats. Just a normal day.
And then, bam, gunshots, chaos everywhere. But here's what makes Aaron's story so incredible. He's a trained paramedic, and he immediately jumps in to help, tending to a wounded young woman.
Just think about that for a second. The sheer terror mixed with that instinct to help. And as if that wasn't enough, Aaron ends up taking shelter with a mixed group of people, Arabs and Jews. A powerful reminder, I think, that in those moments of fear and uncertainty, our shared humanity can often cut through the divisions we perceive.
It's an incredibly powerful story, but Aaron's experience is just one of many. Yeah,
It really puts a human face on this conflict.
it does. And as you said before, this isn't an isolated incident.
No, not at all. Remember those attempted aerial attacks on Tel Aviv?
From Lebanon and Yemen?
Yeah, those were really concerning.
Yeah.
They show a growing willingness to launch attacks across borders.
And wasn't there also that bombing in August?
You're right, there was that attack in August.
Mm-hmm.
Both Hamas and Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility for that one.
Didn't they call it a suicide bombing?
They did. They actually called it a suicide bombing, which is significant.
Why is that significant?
Well, if true, it would be the first suicide bombing in Tel Aviv since 2016.
Wow. I didn't realize it had been that long.
Yeah, and while Israeli police didn't officially classify it as a suicide bombing at the time, the fact that it was even considered a possibility is a big deal.
It really shows how far things have escalated.
Exactly.
So how does this all tie back into the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, it's impossible to separate this from that decades-long conflict, right?
Yeah.
Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they're framing these attacks as a response or retaliation even for what they see as, well, violence against Palestinians in Gaza.
So essentially, it's this terrible cycle. One act of violence just leads to another.
Sadly, yes. And it becomes very difficult to see a way out. You've got these deep-seated grievances on both sides fueling this cycle. It's a really complex situation with multiple actors, multiple agendas, and it makes finding a peaceful resolution incredibly challenging.
It's like, and I'm not saying this is the right way to think about it, but it's almost like this powder keg just waiting for any little spark to set it off.
I think that's a pretty apt analogy. And what makes it even more volatile is that you have all these factions and internal divisions. Even within the Palestinian territories, you've got groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and they don't always see eye to eye. There are hardliners on all sides. So even if you were to try and have some kind of dialogue or negotiation, it's really, really difficult to get everyone on the same page.
And then, of course, you have external actors like Iran, who are basically adding fuel to the fire, pursuing their own interests in the region.
Right. You can't forget about those external influences. They definitely play a role.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've talked about horrific act of terrorism, 6 innocent lives lost, countless others impacted, the escalating tensions across the region, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a lot to process, for sure.
It is, and it's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all.
But if we take anything away from this deep dive, it's that these aren't just headlines, right? These are real people, people like Aaron, who are caught in the middle of this, people who show incredible courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy.
That's what we have to remember. Behind every headline, there's a human story.
Exactly. So I guess the question is, where do we go from here? What happens now? What are the potential consequences of this attack, especially given, how volatile the region is?
Well, historically speaking, attacks like this, especially those occurring during times of heightened tension, they have the potential to be real turning points. They can either escalate things, leading to even more violence and pushing peace further away, or, and this is always the hope, they can serve as this wake-up call, this tragic reminder of the human cost of conflict.
So it could go either way. It could make things worse, or it could be the catalyst for some kind of push for peace.
Sadly, that's often how it goes. It's hard to predict which way it will swing.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? What path will we choose? Will this tragedy be just another reason for more division? Or can it somehow become a reason to work towards a more peaceful future? We don't have the answers, unfortunately.
We don't.
But I think even just asking these tough questions, facing this complex reality head-on, is a start. It's a step.
It is. Knowledge is power.
And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us for this incredibly important conversation. Until next time on The Deep Dive, remember to keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking understanding, because it's something this world desperately needs.